Recently, it's become pretty evident that Universal Studios is definitely leaning into their nostalgia. And it's an interesting topic because I do think it is a unique thing that Universal Studios does have is some of these nostalgic rides that people look back on. And I think it would be something very popular to bring back into the theme parks. But one thing that is really interesting, and I have noticed over the years, is the E.T. ride has kind of had this resurgence in popularity. There's been no new E.T. movies that have come out. You can say the same thing for Back to the Future if you've seen a resurgence of that, especially with Universal featuring it in merchandise. Sensational, the parade they had over the summer, the tribute store. So they're definitely featuring these things quite a bit. And we have a video here from Attraction Ideas that talks about Universal Studios' oldest ride being E.T. is having a resurgence again, because if you look at the wait times on this ride, I mean, it used to be pretty much a walk-on, but it is not uncommon to see 30, 45 minutes up to an hour wait for this ride, and really nothing has changed about this. So I figured this would be a fun one to check out and see what his perspective is on this, because I do think this is a topic that lately I have really enjoyed. So we're going to watch this video and react to it. So hi, I'm Jared with Capture the Magic, and we will start this up right now.
Universal Studios Florida is approaching 35 years of age, and throughout that duration, there is only one ride that has been in operation throughout that entire time period. That ride being E.T. Adventure, the only ride from opening day that is still at the park today. A ride that is based on a movie that came out over 40 years ago and has not had any sequels or spin-offs or remakes, with the exception of, I guess, that one Xfinity holiday commercial, and is only rumored to still be at the park today simply because Universal's greatest creative partner, Steven Spielberg, demands that it stays there, lest he cuts off all contact with Universal as a studio.
I have heard that Steven Spielberg is very adamant that E.T. stay in the parks.
Now, though this could very well just be an old wives' tale, the reason why this legend persists is because E.T., for really all of recent history, has been one of the least popular attractions at Universal Studios Florida. Sure, among the Universal core fan base, the dedicated fans, the diehard fans, of course, by and large, they love E.T., but across...
I can speak to that because on our podcast, like last year, we did a ride tier list. And in the ride, and if you're not familiar, you do like S, A, B, C, and D tier list. So in that tier list, I think we put E.T. as like C, in that we enjoy it. We ride it with our kids, but it was something that, you know, if it was too busy or we may not do it every single time we go to the park, but we definitely enjoy the ride. And we got a lot of feedback on that in terms of a lot of people were very upset that E.T. was put into that category. So it does have a very strong fan base, and a lot of people are very passionate about it, which, again, it makes sense. It's an opening day attraction for Universal. Like, in terms of the history of Universal, like, they don't have the history of, say, like the Disney parks do. So E.T. being its oldest ride and opening day attraction, I definitely think it's got a lot of fanfare for it. And, again, I think you also talk about the IP aging well. I think like things like that lead into that.
The general public, this ride is one of the lowest wait time rides, historically speaking, at Universal Studios Florida. Sure, for the first decade of operation, when E.T. was like the only ride that operated properly, it was one of the most popular rides. But now that E.T. is over 40 years old, it tends to be one of the least popular attractions in the park. That is, until today. In a shocking turn of events, E.T. in the year 2024, almost 35 years after it first debuted at the park, has managed to pull off its most popular year in decades. No longer being a bottom performer at the park and one of the least popular attractions, but instead, on many days, being one of the most popular attractions at the park. I mean, how is this even possible? This cannot be true. I have to be lying through my teeth right now, because E.T., again, based on a super old movie that becomes less and less relevant year after year. Yes, I love E.T. as a film. I'm sure many of you watching do, but let's be honest, younger and newer audiences are becoming less and less familiar with E.T. as time goes on.
That's true for the most part, but the younger generations are consuming older content from like the 80s and 90s a lot more. And I do think there's younger generations that are much more aware of E.T. than perhaps like when I was a kid watching older movies necessarily. Like when I grew up, I don't remember watching older movies because I wanted to. I would watch them because my parents had them on or something along those lines. But I think Part of it, honestly speaking, I think a lot of the content out there today is just not very good. Obviously, there is some good stuff. For the most part, there's just a lot of stuff out there that's not great. And I think the younger generations have, maybe you call it being a hipster or whatever you want to call it, but going back and watching some of this older content, I do think there are younger generations that have enjoyed and are starting to enjoy a lot of this older content like E.T. and Back to the Future that generations before maybe didn't consume content the same way.
Plus, as time goes on, this older attraction is going to continue to be outpaced and outclassed by newer Universal creations. So inevitably, one would expect that the ride as a whole will become less relevant and less popular as time goes on. That's just simple math. And yet, here's E.T. pulling a rabbit out the hat saying, "I'm not dead quite yet." Don't believe me? Let's take a look at the numbers, folks. From 2019 through 2022, of course, this was kind of a up and down time period for Universal with COVID and all that stuff going on, but 2019 and 2022 were the two highest attendance years in Universal's history, period. And in both of those years, E.T. Adventure posted an average wait time of 25 minutes. Mind you, this was well below the average wait time across the entire park at Universal Studios Florida. Universal Studios Florida in 2022 posted an average wait time of 35 minutes across the board.
Although I'll bet you Supercharged was probably like 15 or 20 minutes. I think that was probably the least the wait time being the least highest out of any ride. If I were to guess, I think I remember seeing that number before, but I don't think E.T. was ever the lowest if you factor in Supercharged.
10 minutes more than what E.T. had, proving that it was one of the lesser popular attractions at the park. And here's the thing too, E.T. does not have exceptional capacity. The capacity is good, but it's nothing special. So if you're gonna go ahead and make the argument that E.T. has a lower wait time because its capacity is so good, therefore it's churning through guests so quickly that it can have a lower wait time, not necessarily the case. E.T.'s capacity is not anything special. And to give you a little more context here, E.T.'s hourly capacity is 1,500 riders an hour. Compare this to a ride that tends to get higher wait times than E.T. and Revenge of the Mummy.
I'm just commenting because that part they just showed where you go through and E.T. says your name at the end. I'm pretty sure it's kind of an ongoing joke. I think out of the last 10 times we've ridden that, I think it's actually read our names out loud one time. So typically it doesn't work. Because you've never ridden this, when you go in there, you get a card, you tell there's someone at a computer and you tell them your name and they put it on a card. You hand it to a team member before you load into the ride vehicle, and then ET is supposed to say your name at the end. Doesn't typically work, which kind of makes it almost like it's a part of the attraction that doesn't work properly, but it also kind of makes it a fun aspect of like, are they going to say it correctly? Or usually in our case, it's saying completely different names, but that's kind of actually a fun aspect of this, but not something you could really plan for. It's almost become its own thing, like an ongoing joke, perhaps.
Ride has 2,000 riders per hour in its capacity. So yeah, that kind of tells you everything you need to know as far as what this wait time really means. Now, in 2023, things changed pretty drastically at Universal Studios Florida. Attendance dropped by over 9% at the park, which ultimately led to wait times at the park dropping by 2 minutes on average. However, interestingly, E.T. showed resilience in this year. Despite less guests in the park,
I do love the queue of E.T. though. Like, it's got that unique smell to it. And if you think about how old this ride is, like, that queue was way ahead of its time in terms of, it's very common now to have these queues that like extend the story and be a themed queue. That really wasn't the case whenever this ride was built. And I think that part of it has stood the test of time. Now, there are aspects of it that don't work properly. Like when you do have decent crowds in here, they will run some of the animatronics in there. Those aren't always working all the time. But in terms of just the theming and the trees and everything in here, it does set a really cool tone. And I will mention, whenever it's really hot outside, it is inside and it is very cool in this building, which definitely helps it in terms of people wanting to ride it.
Despite wait times dropping across the park, E.T. not only maintained its wait time, it actually increased its wait time by 1 minute to 26. Certainly noteworthy and maybe even quite impressive for E.T. that it was able to do this in 2023, but does it really mean that much? I mean, after all, E.T. is still an underperformer at the park. It still is one of the lower attended rides. It still is one of the lesser popular attractions, just simply based on the disparity between the average wait time and where E.T.'s posted. But this, folks, was really just a sneak peek of what was to come, because in 2024, was when E.T. would really blow the roof off the place and blow people's minds with just how popular it would become. Now, we don't have the official attendance numbers for 2024 yet. Those will come around mid-year. But what we do know is, given the fact that attendance dropped in 2023, we expect that it will drop again in 2024, because the whole reason why people are skipping out on Universal in 2023 and in 2024 is because they know Epic Universe is opening in 2025. So
I completely agree. I made this argument many times that, this theme park being so highly anticipated, it was in the short term going to affect Universal in the negative in that way, because if you were going to go to Universal, most people that are, especially during a time period where, you've got inflation, a lot of people are just trying to pinch, pennies more, be more responsible with their spending. I do think that a lot of people are saying, okay, let's just wait until this new theme park is open and then we'll go. So I've felt all along 2023, 2024, we're going to be, down years for Universal. The early part of 2025, I'm assuming as well, is going to be a pretty down year for Universal until Epic opens. So that's something that I completely agree with what he's saying there.
A lot of people are choosing to hold off on their Universal trips until that park opens. Thus, the drop in attendance in 2023 and an expected continued drop in attendance in 2024. And the wait times reflect this, as the average wait time went from 33 minutes in 2023 down to just 30 minutes flat in 2024, showing that maybe we might have even saw a larger drop in attendance than we saw from 2022 to 2023.
Which again would make a lot of sense, because in 2023, you got some people planning trips out. They may be like, it's 2 years away. In 2024, literally you could just say, hey, let's wait a year before we go. So that would make sense if, and what he's talking about when we find out those numbers, it's the T report. It's the Themed Entertainment Association's, annual theme park attendance reports. And it's not a for sure number that comes from the theme parks themselves, but they do have some sort of system to gather up these numbers that is looked across as like the industry standard. So looking at this and more than likely just thinking how this would go, I do think Universal could look at even more of a drop in 2024 than they had in just 2023 as well.
So given this drop, it would be pretty impressive even if ET was able to maintain its wait time year over year. But folks, it didn't just maintain, it grew its wait time from 26 minutes to 30 minutes flat, making it an average ride at Universal Studios Florida as opposed to a below average ride. And keep in mind, it did this in a year when quite literally every other ride at Universal Studios Florida saw lower wait times year over year because there were less people in the park. And their wait times were going down everywhere else, and yet somehow more people turned out to ET in 2024 despite that. That's insane. This isn't just the case of ET getting more popular in a year when Universal Studios Florida saw more people at the park, or the whole park as a whole was more popular. No. E.T. is getting more popular while the rest of the park is getting less popular. It is literally stealing attendance and stealing attention away from other attractions. That is how popular this ride has all of a sudden become. And listen to this, folks. Escape from Gringotts, the most popular ride in the park, went from a 53-minute wait to 47. Rip Ride Rocket went from 37 to 32. Transformers went from 39 to 36. And yet here's older, less technologically advanced, and less relevant E.T. somehow gaining attendance in this year. Now you may be saying to yourself, hold up, this doesn't make sense. There's no way that E.T. became more popular in this year. There has to be something behind the numbers that explains it. We know that E.T. doesn't have high capacity. Is it possible that it has low capacity? And maybe it's the low capacity that's overinflating the wait time because they just can't get through guests quickly enough. Well, not really. E.T. does have more capacity than Escape from Gringotts, which is kind of crazy to think, but yeah, it does. So,
just before he even finishes that, E.T. has pretty decent capacity. If you think about each ride vehicle, I believe it sets 4 or 5 across and it goes 4 rows deep. So each vehicle holds a pretty good amount. It's not quite an Omnimover type of ride, but it's kind of, it keeps moving. Basically, you get on the platform and you go, so it is able to move people there rather quickly. So it's not bad. I'm sure he'll show some other examples, but it's probably up there in terms of not the highest, but definitely not going to be the lowest. Probably somewhere in the middle, which again, for an old attraction, is not a bad accomplishment.
Yeah, ET doesn't have crazy high capacity, but it also doesn't have low capacity either. So that's not really the answer here. Also, you might be saying, well, maybe the ride had a lot of downtime. Maybe it was delayed a lot. Maybe it broke down a lot. And maybe that just backed up the line and made the wait time longer artificially. Not quite. ET actually, despite being 35 years old, is extremely reliable. It doesn't go down very often, and even when it does, it typically isn't down for more than an hour. So it's pretty reliable, all things considered, so you can't put it on that either. No, folks, it's a fact. ET got more popular in 2024, the most popular that it's ever been in recorded history, as far back as we have wait time data for. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's fact. It's true, and you can see it in the numbers. And now that we're all on the same page in agreeing and kind of coming to the realization that, yeah, holy cow, ET actually did become substantially popular in 2024, now I go ahead and tell you the reason why this happened. How did ET become so popular out of nowhere? Well, folks, the answer is twofold. For one, Kid Zone, the land that was directly adjacent to ET, that was basically a ghost town for the last decade or so that it was open, got replaced.
I can agree with that. The Kid Zone that was there, like our kids when this was open were quite a bit younger, and there was really nothing in there that interests our kids. In fact, pretty sure my wife has PTSD still because in Fievel's Playland, lost our son for like a 5-minute period. He was just in the back relieving himself, if you will, at that age. But yeah, it's one where after that happened and just really did not want to go back there, and Woody Woodpecker and those IPs didn't appeal to our kids at all. So I will say it was a very aged out area of the park.
By DreamWorks Land, which opened in the summer of 2024. Ultimately, this new land brought a ton more foot traffic in front of ET.
It's a very valid point, because you did have a lot more people checking this out for that reason. And he may point this out, they put up a brand new ET sign because ET's kind of tucked back there. So, you had some people perhaps that weren't aware it was there, but they put a brand new sign there that also brought attention to it as well.
That people who typically would not walk over to ET ever now find themselves right outside the entrance, and many of them said, hey, while I'm here, I'll go ahead and check out this ride that I wouldn't have checked out otherwise. The other part of this is that alongside this new land opening, ET got itself a brand new massive sign for the ride.
And it's a good looking sign.
Previously, the ride sign was not visible from the main path going from...
I do think that's a decent point, is that from that main path there was no real big sign that showed it was there, unless you were looking at a park map or looking on the map on your phone. You wouldn't necessarily know it's there if you were somebody who doesn't frequent Universal Studios a lot.
New York to Springfield, you could easily walk that path and not even notice that ET was over there. You would have no idea. But now there's this massive sign. Even if you have no intention of walking over to DreamWorks Land, you now know ET is over there, and that's a ride that maybe people want to check out on their way throughout that part of the park. So basically, to boil it down, ET got increased foot traffic and greater advertisement with a much better sign that let people know that the ride is there to begin with. And now the ET's average wait time is just a sneeze away from Universal's presumably more popular rides, the rides that are based on big time franchises that are much newer and much more relevant and have much more advanced technology. It really is telling a pretty big story. And it isn't just that, oh, ET has more people standing in front of it, therefore it's doing better. No. In fact, it means a whole lot more than that, because guests are actively choosing to ride this attraction. It doesn't matter if they're in the area, they are still choosing to spend their time in their day, a day that they spent hundreds of dollars to be there for, mind you. They are willing and choosing on their own will to ride this ride for one reason or another, and that reason is important for Universal to understand because it means a whole dang lot. And in fact, I think that the meaning behind this is actually twofold. I think for one, that it proves that people in this park are craving more family-friendly attractions.
I agree with that. I do think that's something that Universal has lacked historically. They are adding more to it. Obviously, DreamWorks Land adds that. ET fits into that well also because you got families going in there. So to the other point of bringing more foot traffic to that area, but they've also been, adding more minion stuff. Like that is something that they have needed. And I think Epic Universe is yet another step in that, because if you look at Epic Universe, you do have Stardust Racers, but you also have a lot of family-friendly lands and rides in there. If you got Super Nintendo World, all of those rides are in there, are going to be very family-friendly. How to Train Your Dragon is very similar to that. You've got the Constellation Carousel that's in Celestial Park. Ministry of Magic is probably family-friendly. Don't know a lot about that ride, but I'm assuming most families would be able to ride that. And then you talk about Dark Universe, not so much. Dark Universe is not one that fits that, but again, Epic Universe is adding a lot more rides and lands to this, so I do think that a lot of them are going to be very family-friendly, so I think his point there is pretty valid.
Universal has built their name. They've built their foundation on the back of high-intensity, thrilling attractions. And that's great and all, and it certainly has put them on the map for sure. And having those attractions that Disney down the road is not going to build themselves is really helping to differentiate Universal. But now that Universal has gotten to the point where they are trying to directly compete with Disney, they're no longer fighting for the crumbs. They're no longer fighting to become the minority partner in a Disney World trip. They're
very valid point. Universal is definitely going after trying to shift what typically was people went to Disney for 3 to 4 days. They would add on 1 to 2 days at Universal. They're trying to flip that to where the people go the majority of their trip to Universal and maybe add on a Disney trip to 1, 2, maybe 3 days. I think that is a very valid point and something that Universal has openly stated that's what they haven't mentioned Disney in that, but they were trying to become a week-long vacation destination.
Trying to overtake them for many people on their Orlando trips. They need to appeal to a wider audience base. They need to appeal to a broader audience, and it's important that they are able to compete on the family-friendly front. And quite frankly, they are losing that battle right now. If you are a family with young kids going to Universal Studios Florida, there is very little for you to do. You have the 2 Despicable Me attractions, you have DreamWorks Land, and you have E.T., and then a couple flat rides. That's basically it. There's not much for you to do here. So it's
on the studio side, true, but I guess in their defense, they have added more things in the recent history, because that has been the biggest gripe, especially like when we really started going to Universal. There was not much at all on the studio side for kids. There really was not. I mean, you had the kids zone, but that area was really outdated with those IPs, and it was more or less, you could spend maybe an hour in there, but it was nothing that really our kids or most kids really had a lot of interest in doing. You have Despicable Me, like Minion Mayhem, but then they added Despicable Me Villain Con, which Villain Con I don't think has been a huge success. That's typically pretty much a walk-on attraction, but it is something they have added that families and younger kids can do. So they have added more things in the recent history. To the success of those things, that is definitely debatable. I think DreamWorks Land is something that is an improvement from Kids Zone. You can definitely tell, like, it didn't have a huge budget for that area. They just rethemed the Woody Woodpecker roller coaster to Trolls, but they did add the DreamWorks show back there, which our kids really enjoy. They have meet and greets. Like, they've added, the Shrek stuff in there, the play area. So they have been adding more things on the studio sides for kids. Now, in Islands of Adventure, you do have Seuss Landing, like you have the Marvel stuff that has some kid rides in there. You got the Toon Lagoon, which again, I think that's an outdated area, but it does have things for kids to do there. So there is more things on Islands of Adventure side, but the studio side has added things in the recent history.
No wonder then that E.T. saw a huge spike in attendance when, of course, a lot of the new people who came to Universal in 2024 who weren't afraid to, wait out for Epic Universe were young families, because they were excited by the opening of DreamWorks Land. It actually meant, hey, there's more for my young kids to do at this park that actually appeals to them. It isn't themed to characters from the 50s. So E.T. was really able to benefit big time this year for being one of the few bastions of family-friendly attractions in this park. So what this really shows is that Universal needs to build more family-friendly attractions. If they could take that new high level of theming and of technological advancements and bring it to new family-friendly attractions like E.T., E.T. would no longer be as popular as it is, because you would have newer attractions that would be gobbling up all those guests. And I'm sure there are plenty of guests who visit Orlando all the time, who visit Disney World in particular all the time, who maybe know about Universal but have never gone because it doesn't appeal to their group or their party who has a lot of young kids in it. Right? If you were to go ahead and build more family attractions, rides that everyone in the family could do together, that would go ahead and really appeal to that group and help bring them to Universal. Well,
I don't know if that would directly affect ET's wait times. It could, but I don't think this is a singular thing. Like all the reasons here laid out. Also, I think you have to factor in nostalgia with older IPs. I think a lot of these things, like people have nostalgia, they want to do these older type attractions. When you're talking about like ET and Back to the Future and some of these IPs that are these older movies, the fact that they haven't had any remakes or sequels or anything like that definitely helps them. I think there's, you call it the 20 to 30 year rule of, whenever you saw these things as a kid and then you get older, you can remember. It's almost like a time capsule. You can go back and watch it and just remember how it was, and nobody's messed with it. And that's something, I think, given an era where everything has a prequel, everything has a sequel, and really these things, like, I'm not a huge fan of prequels. I actually loathe them for the most part. Of the ones that are good, you can probably have 10 more that just really mess up the original movies and IPs. I would much rather not mess with prequels, and for the most part, most sequels I could definitely do without. I think many times less is more when it comes to movies, but I think E.T. is a prime example of something that hasn't been messed with, and maybe for a period of time people think, oh, that looks old, like, oh, I don't care about that. But as time goes on, you become nostalgic and really wanting that feeling you had as a kid seeing that. And I do think that E.T. is starting to get into this category here when you talk about in the parks of people really liking this ride seemingly yet again. Another thing too, this is a dark ride. Universal doesn't have a lot of dark rides, and dark rides are ones that for the most part really people enjoy quite a bit. I mean, Disney has made a ton of dark rides that have basically lasted the test of time that people still enjoy that are not new attractions. So it could be a combination of more foot traffic to that area, more advertising that this ride is there, coupled with the nostalgia, the younger families coming in. It can be all those things, but I don't necessarily think even if you just put a bunch of new attractions for young kids in here that it would directly mean that ET would lose, the wait time would get lower. I think there is, and maybe it's something you can't quite put your finger on, but there is some hunger for ET or something like it, especially with Universal and the older IPs, the nostalgia that does, I think, lead to ET having this resurgence. And not to mention as well, this past year in 2024, I mean, Universal went all out and basically 80s and 90s nostalgia with the tribute store, with the parade, with Sensational, of really promoting these older IPs, E.T., Jaws, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters. Like, this is something that was a major focus of Universal Studios last year. So part of that could be also the fact Universal is promoting these older IPs, this nostalgia for these IPs in the theme parks that could have led to this as well.
While at the same time, giving families with young kids who are already coming to the park a better experience. The other thing that I think Universal needs to take away from E.T. becoming popular again out of nowhere is that people are beginning to seek out more practical and physical experiences. The fact that E.T. can come out here as a 35-year-old ride that's based on a movie that's over 40 years old and can be more popular than your newer Scream-based rides and Fast and Furious Supercharged. And
well, let's be fair. Supercharged is terrible. So you could have a very basic ride, and I think more people would want to do it versus Supercharged. So, I mean, Supercharged is almost on an entirely different level of bad, but point taken.
Race to New York starring Jimmy Fallon,
also a bad ride,
says a lot about what people think about Scream-based rides right now.
That is a good point. I mean, Universal has gotten a lot of flack over the years about these Scream-based attractions, and I don't think a Scream-based attraction equals necessarily bad. I mean, I don't think that is the case, but I do think the overuse of screens over the years is something that I think there's legitimate criticism on. Now, Universal hasn't had the luxury of space like, say, Disney has had historically, of being able to, build out these major attractions. So I think screens were a way to do this in a tighter fitting spot, which one thing with Epic Universe, if you look at the rides in that park, I'm sure Ministry of Magic is going to utilize screens, but for the most part, most of the attractions and rides in there are not using screens. I mean, I'm sure the Frankenstein ride in Dark Universe is going to use screens, but it's also using a lot of active set pieces with animatronics and things like that. So they're definitely in Epic Universe not relying on screens like they have previously. So as they're moving forward, they're not doing it as much, but it is a legitimate criticism. In the past, the overuse of screens, and I do think people do like live action set pieces more than just a screen-based attraction.
Ultimately, unless a screen-based ride is really delivering something super special, think about a Forbidden Journey or Escape from Gringotts, people are not going to turn out for it. I mean, even E.T. was able to garner a higher wait time than The Simpsons. So I do think that
Yeah, but I don't like The Simpsons. My wife is still bitter. I'm still bitter on some level that the Back to the Future ride was taken away for The Simpsons. That's a sore subject. That is a screen-based ride, but I do love Back to the Future.
Universal already kind of got the memo on this. I mean, the building of Velocicoaster and Hagrid's kind of sent this message already, but then they follow it up with VillainCon Minion Blast, which was the cheapest of the cheap screen-based rides. I mean, it's honestly a complete joke. So that left me a bit perplexed.
I don't hate Minion Blast. I understand what it is. It's trying to be a Toy Story Mania, which I love Toy Story Mania. I think that is a fun ride that you can replay a lot as somebody who's competitive and likes video games. I really enjoy that ride. I think this was their attempt at that. It wasn't executed that great. I mean, it is a ride that can move a lot of people through it, but you get so clogged up with other people. And this ride being like, it's obviously meant for families and kids, but like our kids don't really enjoy this ride because our daughter wants to use the gun that can get the score, but it's a little too heavy for her sometimes. And the little kiddie guns don't register a score. And so I think it's something like I appreciate the effort with it, and I don't hate the ride. But I do think there were better ways to pull this off. But I do believe they also had a very tight space to try and do this as well, given this used to be where Shrek 4D was. But again, I don't hate it. I think something along these lines could be very successful, like a Toy Story Mania type of ride. But this iteration of it clearly has not been a hit because, again, this is typically when we walk by this to pass like 10 times, midday is like a 10-minute wait, maybe 15-minute wait. It's very rare when this thing has a very high wait time.
I'm a little bit confused. Like, does Universal actually know what's going on? Do they actually know what they're doing? Was this a leftover project, or do they actually think that this is what people want to see now? But
I also think budget-wise, they probably were using most of the budget for Epic Universe, and so you look like DreamWorks Land and VillainCon Minion Blast. I do think you could tell those probably had fairly limited budgets. Like they still wanted to do stuff, which I will commend them for still adding things into the park while they're building a brand new theme park. But it definitely seemed like the budgets weren't quite there and they were just trying to work within a limited budget for these areas.
When we look at Epic Universe, there's really only one screen-based ride, which is the Ministry of Magic ride. Every other ride, there are some rides that have screens, like Mario Kart. And
that's true. I forgot Mario Kart. It does have a screen, yeah.
Monsters Unchained, but they're using them sort of as a tool and something that's going on in the background, or maybe it's being projected on your glasses, but isn't really like the main feature of the attraction. And if they can continue to follow through with this for new attractions at Universal Studios Florida, Islands of Adventure, and elsewhere, it's going to really benefit them because people really are seeking out those highly themed sets, those extremely fluid and lifelike animatronics. Those are things that people cannot get at home, that cannot completely understand or get the sensation of through a video, a POV of the ride. Whereas a screen-based ride, it's really not delivering anything that they're not already able to get at home, quite frankly, right? It doesn't feel special. It doesn't feel like it's worth the hundreds of dollars they're paying to be there to experience that type of attraction. So Universal, keep that in the back of your mind. I know you're probably already executing on it anyways, but still something to keep in mind here as E.T. Well, let me be the first to congratulate you, E.T. You're back, baby. And even if Spielberg was holding that over Universal's head, that he would break off all communication with them if they got rid of it, I don't think he needs to even threaten them with that anymore, because E.T.'s back, baby. It's one of the most popular rides in the park as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, so long as Universal still has an extreme lack of family-friendly attractions, and of course it continues to get good foot traffic through DreamWorks Land and this brand new sign. I think E.T. is going to remain popular for years to come, and I think that any worries or fears that we had over the last decade or so about E.T. going away, well, I think they can all be washed away.
You can also argue E.T. is kind of Universal Studios' It's a Small World, because obviously, like, It's a Small World has a lot of historical significance to Walt and the World's Fair. You know, you can make an argument that E.T. is that for Universal Studios. And it could very well be a ride that they never mess with, they never update. Like, I do think if they came out and said, we're going to refurb this in terms of not just updating and cleaning it up, but like changing aspects of this ride, I actually think a lot of people would be very upset. I wouldn't want this to really change. Now, I suppose you could do it in subtle ways to update the animatronics where it did function better, but I think for the most part, I think people do like it as it is, because not that the ride's a joke, but I do think it's an ongoing sort of, everyone knows what's going on with this. It's not the most technologically advanced ride, but people just understand and appreciate the nostalgia, and really maybe it was something they rode as kids and they remember what it felt like and they enjoy it as an adult. Like, there is something to that as well.
The way I think E.T.'s here to stay, because oh boy, it's the most popular it's been in decades, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. So anyways, let me know what you think in the comments about ET's
I agree. Like, all the points he made are very valid. So again, go check out Attraction Ideas. It's a really good channel. We react to their content quite a bit here. Go subscribe over there. And if you do watch it, let them know in the comments. We sent you over and said hello. But I agree with most of the stuff he was saying here. Now, I think he's underselling, in my opinion, a bit of this nostalgia and these older IPs, like sort of resurgence in general. I think that does play into this a little bit. And also, too, considering that the attendance has been down at Universal 23 and probably more likely it's going to show in 2024 because a lot of people are waiting to go to Epic Universe, a lot of the foot traffic in the park is obviously going to be annual pass holders, more locals. And I think ET definitely holds a spot with annual pass holders and people who have gone to Universal a long time. It holds a special place in their heart. Again, I'm talking about, we did a ride tier list. We put ET as C just because we said we liked it, but we, it wasn't something we were going to go out of our way every single time to ride if it was too high of a wait time, and got a lot of flack for that. A lot of people were very upset where we placed that. And I think it has its fan base amongst the people that are loyal to Universal Studios. So that is probably something as well. You probably had more AP traffic coming in to want to ride this potentially. Plus you add in more foot traffic to DreamWorks Land. It does have the sign now. Like, a lot of these things, I don't think it's just one singular thing. I think it's probably a multitude of different things here. But it is interesting that a very old attraction, the oldest attraction at Universal Studios, would see an increase in wait times in recent years, and nothing has changed with it. They didn't update the queue. They didn't update anything about the ride. So it's very rare that you see that. I don't know if that's ever happened, like, say, at Disney. I can't recall a ride that has had this resurgence in attendance without some sort of refurb done to it. So it's definitely unique and interesting on that level. And I do think, and again, it speaks to the nostalgic thing. And I do think you give what they did last summer with all the older properties and nostalgia. If any theme park company was going to do an older IP and make a new ride based off an older IP, I do think it would be Universal Studios. I was on Orange Grove 55's channel, good friends of the channel. We were discussing this on an episode of on their channel. And we were talking about, would they bring back, maybe Back to the Future, Jaws, Ghostbusters as a new attraction, maybe even like Beetlejuice as a new attraction into the parks. I'm not saying they will, but I think if any theme park company was going to do it, I do think Universal Studios would do it. Personally speaking, I think if you brought Back to the Future as a new attraction, maybe the same type of attraction was before, maybe a Kuka arm-based ride that kind of puts you in the DeLorean and you are able to do stuff in there, I think it would be a massive success. I think that would be one of the highest wait times in the park, as I think there's a lot of people that have a lot of demand for these older IPs. Like Back to the Future has aged very well, and yet again, it hasn't had anybody, no sequels, no prequels, nothing's been messed with that IP, and I think that's something that would actually be very popular. So I am curious, we see that in the next 5 to 10 years perhaps, of some sort of older IP, an older ride that was taken away that could be put back into the parks. You can make the same argument for Jaws. I think a lot of people will be very excited if they brought back Jaws on some level. So I think these older nostalgic IPs is something Universal has that they can use. It's a unique thing that maybe Disney quite doesn't have on the same level. Like, obviously Disney has older IPs that they use in the parks, but I think the ones at Universal are a little bit different, in a way more pop culture-ish, and not as much. Like, to me, there's Disney nostalgia and then there's like pop culture nostalgia. I feel like Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, Jaws, it's much more pop culture nostalgia and a little bit different, obviously, Universal Studios nostalgia as well. But it's a very interesting topic, and I saw this pop up, and it was something we were talking about the other day. And it's interesting. It's fun to talk about. But either way, that's going to be it, though, for this video. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel, as we do lots of coverage here of Universal Studios, Epic Universe, Disney World, and pop culture. And again, let us know in the comments, what do you think is the reason for the resurgence in ET at Universal Studios? And until next time, we will see you in the parks.